In Italy, there's been the biggest daily rise in deaths since the beginning of the outbreak there. Almost 1,000 people have died in the past 24 hours, taking the total number of deaths in Italy to more than 9,000. Well, Mark Lowen is in Rome for us tonight, and this huge increase is in a country that's been locked down now for more than 2 weeks.
Yeah, really shocking figures, Sophie. It's like Italy is losing the equivalent of a village a day. 919 deaths in the past 24 hours. That's over 200 more than the previous one-day rise. In the northern region of Lombardy alone, 540 people have died there in the past day. You mentioned that lockdown that's been in place for over 2 weeks. It is flattening the curve. The infection rate is slowing here, but the progress is slow and it is uneven, and the awful news just keeps on coming. 46 doctors have now died here since the outbreak began. The National Health Institute says Italy has not yet reached the peak, and the nationwide restrictions might have to be extended for several months. Tonight, meanwhile, the Pope gave a special address on a very, very empty St. Peter's Square. He gave his Urbi et Orbi blessing to the city and the world, which he usually only gives at Christmas and Easter, so another sign of the historic times we're in. He talked of the thick darkness enveloping our cities. He said we find ourselves afraid and lost, and he said doctors, nurses and caregivers were exemplary companions on this journey. But in truth, Sophie, Italians are finding it hard at the moment to keep the faith. They are hoping, pleading, many of them are praying for that peak to come.
Mark Lowen in Rome, thank you. In Spain, the number of coronavirus cases continues to increase, with 769 deaths in 24 hours. With so many critically ill patients, it has meant that more and more are dying alone because their families aren't allowed in. It's putting an enormous emotional strain on families and on medical staff, as our correspondent Damian Grammaticus reports from Madrid.
From his bed, he waves, a moment of triumph in a Spanish hospital. He's their first patient well enough to leave intensive care, but the medical staff are the only people there to see it. That's because every new virus patient brought in is immediately isolated from the outside world. Not even families are allowed to enter hospitals here, and Spain registered another 8,500 cases today.
They are positive in COVID.
It's the awful reality Esther Garcia is facing. She has COVID-19 and tried to isolate herself, but she thinks she may have infected both her parents, Maria Paz and Constantino, both now positive, both in hospital and beyond her reach.
You cannot hug, you cannot kiss, you cannot see the other. And it's a situation of so many other people here.
Esther's parents are being treated here in this hospital. It's one of the cruelest aspects of this outbreak, the rigorous separation that has to be enforced between the sick and everyone else. It's so contagious. This is where her parents were admitted. Many hospitals are at double their capacity. Staff don't have time to answer phones or update families. It's what happens when a health service is swamped. Spain didn't bring in its lockdown quickly enough or test enough people to track the virus's progress. So now people are dying in Spain's hospitals, hundreds and hundreds every day, not surrounded by loved ones, but isolated and alone.
It's a very isolated illness. People get sick alone, and they die alone, and they are buried alone, and you cannot do anything, you cannot be with them.
Esther has found a way to reach her parents. A nurse has got a phone in. Her father is improving, but her mother's condition is serious. And night and day as the virus advances, more families are being separated. Sylvia, who works in one of the hospitals worst affected, posted this notice this week saying she'll pass messages to those inside. These are the ones she's delivering tonight.
The family tell me that I say, I love you so much, I'm here with you, we can see you, but I'm here, something like this.
Sylvia is a nurse assistant, just 24 years old, delivering comfort to the dying. Spain's medics now shouldering the emotional burden of this crisis too. Damian Grammaticus, BBC News, Madrid.
In France, the lockdown has been extended for another 2 weeks until the middle of April, with a warning it could be extended further than that. Almost 2,000 people have died there now, including a 16-year-old girl whose death this week has shaken many people in France. President Trump has signed into law a $2 trillion emergency spending package to relieve the impact of the coronavirus on the US economy. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs as a result of the crisis. More than 100,000 people in the States now have the virus. That's more than any other country in the world. Almost half of them are in New York State. From there, here's Nick Bryant.
New York, New York, the worst infected city in what's now the worst infected country. There was always the sense that this planetary pandemic would end up ravaging this global hub. And while there's a deceptive calm on its now quiet streets, behind the doors of its inundated hospitals, the crisis is getting worse. Emergency calls have hit their highest levels since the attacks of September the 11th. Hospital staff are describing a tsunami of patients flooding their emergency rooms. We're thought to be 3 weeks away from the peak here, and already they're exhausted.
It's been like a war zone, a medical war zone. I'm working with limited resources, with the constant disparities and pain and suffering that we see, not only with those who are afflicted with the coronavirus, but also those who are coming in for trauma. And so it's very physically and mentally exhausting.
The very things that make New York so great have now made it vulnerable. Its vibrancy, the fact that it's such a melting pot.
We're so dense, we're so together, which is what makes us special, gives us that New York energy, gives us that New York mojo. It also, that density becomes the enemy in a situation like this.
In Midtown Manhattan, something we haven't seen since 9/11. Refrigerated trucks ready to store the corpses of the dead. Each one is capable of holding up to 44 bodies. And these workmen were constructing a makeshift morgue. America is paying the price for not being prepared, for not taking the coronavirus seriously enough when it was ripping through China, for not ramping up testing quickly enough when it first came to these shores, for losing precious time. Like the rest of the world, America is not just facing a public health crisis, but an economic emergency. Category 5 style devastation to the businesses forced to shutter their doors. At least Congress has now passed a $2 trillion stimulus package, a lifeline to an economy that this week saw its biggest unemployment spike in history.
I've never signed anything with a T on it. I don't know if I can handle this one, Mitch.
This bipartisan legislation was signed into law tonight by America's billionaire president. Republican lawmakers at his side, but the Democrats cold-shouldered. Election year, political distancing.
And then one day we get hit with this thing that nobody ever heard of before. Nobody ever even heard of before. And now we're fighting a different battle. But I really think in a fairly short period of time, because of what they've done, and what everyone's done, I really think we're going to be stronger than ever.
America is on a war footing, led by a commander-in-chief, desperate but unable to declare victory. Nick Bryant, BBC News, New York.